Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about a little bit about inflammation. We already talked about this in class, but I wanted to review. So inflammation is the local defensive response to tissue injury, which includes trauma as well as infection. Sometimes we don't always think about trauma as being um, associated with inflammation, but it absolutely is. So the general purposes of inflammation are to limit the spread of pathogens and then destroy them, as well as remove debris from damaged tissues. So remember that macrophages are the principal phagocytic cells that get rid of things like erythrocytes as well as broken down tissue. And inflammation also initiates the tissue repair mechanisms. So there's four cardinal signals of inflammation, and these are redness, swelling, heat, and pain. So if you think about when you've cut yourself or if you have a gross pimple, you generally have all four of these signals. So if you remember from other classes, or I said this in class on Tuesday, itis generally denotes that there's inflammation of certain organs. So arthritis, pancreatitis, or dermatitis would refer to inflammation of the joints, the pancreas, and the skin, respectively. So cytokines are small proteins that are able to regulate inflammation as well as immunity. These are really cool molecules. I think of them as the hormones of the immune system. And so they can be both pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. Again, with pro-inflammatory initiating inflammation and anti-inflammatory trying to stop the inflammation from going too far. So if inflammation goes too far, you get things such as septic shock, where there's actually a quote cytokine storm that causes the body to break down. So cytokines are generally secreted by leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and they alter the physiology of the receiving cell. So they can act either as paracrines or autocrines, so that means that they can affect their neighboring cells or the cell that secretes them, which would make them autocrine. So they can also be a little bit more broad-ranged and be measured within the blood. So that means that they have the potential to affect pretty much any cell in the body. So these cytokines include interferons, which again are those molecules that signal that there's something going wrong within the cell, as well as the interleukins, tumor necrosis factor, chemotactic factors, as well as other factors. It's worth mentioning that chemotactic factors are factors that allow for chemotaxis, which means basically that it's attracting different pro-inflammatory chemicals to the site of injury. So there are three major processes during inflammation. So the first one is mobilizing body defenses, then containment and destruction of the pathogens, and then tissue cleanup and repair. So in mobilization of defenses, that's the most immediate requirement after there's tissue injury or inflammation, is to get the defensive leukocytes to the site quickly so they can get rid of any potential bacteria or other parasites. So this is achieved by local hyperemia, which means that they're increasing blood flow locally to that site of injury. So that means there's local vasodilation due to vasoactive chemicals. So that means that there's vasodilation at the site of injury. Usually there's vasoconstriction just proximal to it so that it's kind of restricting a little bit of blood flow to that so you don't bleed out. So vasoactive chemicals include histamine, the leukotrienes, as well as other cytokines. And if you remember, histamine is secreted by a couple different cells, but mostly by the basophils as well as mast cells. And these are vasodilating chemicals. So they're also secreted by cells that are damaged by trauma. Different toxins or organisms can trigger that inflammation. So if there's a microorganism within you, like a worm, then that's going to trigger inflammation in most cases. So hyperemia also functions to wash toxins and metabolic waste away from that site more rapidly so that it becomes, it's less vulnerable to infection. So these vasoactive chemicals also stimulate the endothelial cells of the vessel to contract and then widens the gaps between those endothelial cells. So this will act to increase the capillary permeability because you're increasing the gaps between the endothelial cells. So this allows fluid, leukocytes, and plasma proteins such as albumin, fibrin, and the immunoglobulins or different globulin proteins to leave the bloodstream. And that also includes complement, antibodies, and clotting proteins. So selectins are cell adhesion molecules that are made by these endothelial cells that aid in recruiting leukocytes to that site of injury. So they make the membrane sticky so that leukocytes are more able to adhere to the vessel wall, and this is called margination. There is something also called diapetes or emigration, and this is leukocytes crawling through the gaps in the endothelial cells, entering the tissue fluid. They're using those fake feet or pseudopodia so that they can get in there. When cells and chemicals have left the bloodstream, you can say that they've been extravasated. So the basis of the 4 cardinal signals of inflammation is because of the mobilization of defenses. So that heat and redness are both going to be from the hyperemia, which is increased blood flow. And the redness is also because of the red blood cells that have left the blood capillaries and gone into the tissue. You also get swelling and edema because of increased fluid filtration from the capillaries, as well as pain, either from the direct injury of nerves or pressure on the nerves from edema, or just stimulating pain receptors by prostaglandins, bacterial toxins, or bradykinin. So that's generally why you get pain at that site. So during the mobilization of defenses, neutrophils begin to marginate so that selectins, which are those adhesive molecules on the inside of a blood vessel, cause the leukocytes to adhere to the blood vessel walls. So during diapetes or emigration, the leukocytes are able to squeeze between the endothelial cells into the tissue space. Remember again that the endothelial cells are contracting and the gaps between them become wider so that it can aid in this diapetes.